I guess I'll just start right away. My name is Daniel Müller. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Osnabrück. And today I'm warmly welcoming my audiences both here and online. And I basically want to tell you about two paradigms of the unconscious and what they tell us about consciousness. So let's dive straight into it. I want to start, as this is, as you might know, a conference about consciousness and not about the unconscious, with a very simple question, as philosophers like to ask them. What is consciousness? Is it basically some very complex integrated information that some complex structures do have, like the human brain, for example? Or is it this? Sensory motor contingencies, so basically the way that your movements influence the way that you perceive something, as Kevin O'Regan and Alvin Noé would assume. Is it this? Basically some quantum processes going on in the microtubules in an orchestrated way, where basically each time we have a superposition, that superposition is resolved by a, let's say, click moment of objective reduction, and from there on, it is basically like the superposition is decided, and that is basically proto-consciousness, and that can be orchestrated and then lead to human consciousness. Would you say that is consciousness? So if you ask me, that's a whole lot of different possible answers for a quite straightforward question. We had, it's in the brain, it's in the body, it's in the universe. We had, it's in the information, it's in the sensory motor contingencies, it's in the objective reduction when it's orchestrated. So the question I want to pose to you is the science of consciousness a lost cause? And the answer is, well, yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention. Let's go out and have a nice beer, a nice smoked beer at the River Main. No, I'm just kidding. Contrary to my namesake, Vincent Müller, I'm actually not convinced that the science of consciousness is a lost case. And I'm going to tell you why. But I still think that we should be a bit conscious and cautious about how we use the term consciousness. So we need to actually get a better understanding of the concept of consciousness, because philosophers have been doing this for centuries, and particularly Ned Block, for example, introduced the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. That was kind of a good start, but I still think that we could clarify the concepts a bit more. That is something that philosophers like to call conceptual engineering. So you basically engineer your concepts in such a way that they are useful and that they can incorporate empirical findings. And I'll only start to do that and give a couple of pointers, and I hope that it might spark your interest and it might inspire you in some ways or not. If it does, you can come to me and we can chat a little bit. So I thought, why not actually looking at it the other way around, sort of? So that was my inspiration for actually talking about the unconscious today, to sort of ex negativo find out what the counter-concept to consciousness is, and then utilize the findings we have from surveying the literature on that to actually make the science of consciousness maybe a bit, trying to unify it at least a little bit. Let's see if we can actually do it. I promise you I can't do it today. I'm just doing the first baby steps. So a useful metaphor that has been often employed for the psyche is that of an iceberg. You have the tip, that's all you see, that's the conscious mental states. You have the stuff that's just around surface level, which is what is called the preconscious, in German das Vorbewusste. And then you have, and that's the largest part of the iceberg, like 7 out of 8 parts of the iceberg are underwater. Those are the unconscious mental states. And now, actually, we are already through with the first point on the content list. That's good. We still have a couple of things to talk about, namely what to expect from this talk. Then I'm going to explain a bit the psychoanalytic ideas of the unconscious, dual process theories of the unconscious, dual systems theories of the unconscious. They are actually quite similar, but also a bit different. And then I'll actually go to hopefully proposing a least smallest common denominator okay, there's an error in the slides, of the unconscious, and then I'll hope to actually address what this means for the science of consciousness. And I realized that I put way too many slides in this presentation, so I'm glad that I'm the last one, so I don't have to look too much out for staying within the bounds of time. All right, so what to expect from this talk? There are a couple questions. Philosophers really love to ask questions. Unfortunately, they also love to answer them, and I think that's where the problem starts, but just like them, and I'm going to start doing it. So the first question that I'd like to address is, how can we model the unconscious? The second question is, well, what is the most common denominator? See, now I actually spelled it correctly this time. Of previous attempts at modeling the unconscious. Is the unconscious cognitive? Is it something else? Is it volitional? Is it affective? Is it emotional? And what does this all tell us about consciousness? Now, don't be scared. I brought to you someone the name of whom might not be called, namely the man, the myth, the legend, Sigmund Freud. He has quite a bad standing in cognitive science nowadays, I find. At least I haven't been taught anything about his teachings, and I did my bachelor's and master's in cognitive science, so yeah. Nonetheless, I think he did actually have some good points. So one thing he observed, and actually he was the one who made this idea really influential, was that not all of human behavior could be explained by introspectable mental phenomena. And we see that in modern research, for example, in implicit attitudes, in sort of the underlying racism and sexism that we do not want to acknowledge we have, but that has been sort of still, diffused into our mind. And yeah, so actually I think he does have a point there. And then he famously posited another psychological system. He even calls it the second consciousness, which might sound a bit paradoxical, given that it is actually the unconscious. However, he also says that we must not think of the unconscious as like one monolithic unity. There's a lot of stuff going on in the unconscious, some of which isn't really that important. It's important, but it's not important for cognition, like control of visceral system, for example. And then there are things that can become conscious. There are habituated, automated things that we just do every time in a similar routine, like, well, it's 9 o'clock, I need to brush my teeth or whatever. And similarly, well, very different mental processes can be conscious. So we shouldn't think of it as like the iceberg, which I previously showed you. That's an oversimplification, obviously. All right, so he basically held that drives and wishes are mainly located in the unconscious. So a lot of times we actually wish for things which we don't even know of and we would maybe be shocked about. So these drives and wishes are complex combinations of volitions and emotions. And one important driver for human behavior is the fulfillment of unconscious wishes. This actually plays a huge role in his theory building, and I think it's also part of why he has fallen out of favor a bit. Namely, he said that some of these wishes are of sexual nature and of children actually desiring their parents. Whatever, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I just want to point to one fact that I also didn't know about before I went into the research, namely, I always thought Freud has a reputation as being unscientific because Karl Popper once pointed out that psychoanalysis is a paradigmatic case of a pseudoscience. Despite that, actually, Freud initially tried to spell out his theory in terms of neurobiology. The problem was, at the time, the mechanistic understanding of neurobiology didn't really allow him to pour his ideas of wish fulfillment and repression into neurobiological vocabulary. And since he was primarily a psychiatrist, he wasn't that interested in like theory building of healthy minds anyways. He was interested in actually trying to help people who had certain disorders. And now, basically, we'll see in a short animated clip how Freud kind of envisions a certain process of something becoming conscious, which then does not become conscious, and we'll see why. So you have a mental content, let's say, I just named it that thing, and all of you have enough imagination to just think about what that could be for you. All right, so it is basically unconscious, and then it wanders from the unconscious through the first sensor, which already is doing some course checking if that involves some Oedipal complex or whatever. And this sensor says, all right, you can go into the foreconscious phase, which is sort of a buffer. So it's vaguely conscious, but not actually really, like it's in the periphery, let's say. And so it moves forward. And then sensor 2 actually says, no, you can't do that. You can't think. Like, this causes a real problem if it would become conscious, because you have a self-image, and this mental content totally contradicts it. Like, this is a wish for violence, while you always thought of yourself as a pacifist. We can't let that through. And so basically it gets kicked back into the unconscious. That is Freud's idea, very, very, very simplified. In the 100 years since he came up with it, a lot has been said about it, but I try to keep it short and simple. So we already, well, I don't know why this pops up here, but we've done what to expect from this talk, and we've done the psychoanalytic idea of the unconscious. So let's move on, and we'll still talk about dual process theories of the unconscious, dual systems theories, the smallest common denominator of the unconscious, and basically what it means for our joint endeavor of the science of consciousness. Right, so in dual process ideas, the general gist is you have one system, one psychological system, and within that system there are different processes, namely unconscious processing and conscious processing. And this is called type 1 and type 2 processing, because, so the argument goes, largely we rely on type 1 thinking unless something special comes up, something that is particularly requiring our attention, such as, I don't know, having an academic discourse or something. Then we switch to type 2 thinking. And this has been basically employed in a lot of different areas in psychology, in learning theory, in reasoning, social cognition, and decision-making. And I want to start out with social cognition. And I brought you a little experiment that has been done like 34 years ago, but it's still actually quite interesting, I think. So this is a theory that Shelley Chaikin actually came up with, and she had two groups. One was the high involvement group, so they were basically seated opposite to an experimenter, and there was basically one phase where that person was nice and likable, and one phase where that person was not nice and not likable. And in one condition, the person gave 2 arguments, and in one condition, the person gave 6 arguments in favor of their position. And the high involvement group was highly involved because they were told that their decision would matter later on in the experimental process. And they decided mostly based on how many arguments were given by the interlocutor, by the other person, and they completely it was completely irrespective of whether that person was likable or not. So we can think of that as type 2 thinking. They didn't get fooled by some quick heuristics, some shortcuts of their brain. They actually listened to the arguments. Now, what is happening mostly in politics nowadays is actually what happened to the low involvement group. They completely ignored the number of arguments because they were told, you'll have a conversation now, and later on we'll talk about something entirely different. And to them, the number of arguments did not matter at all. They only decided whether to join this position or not based on the question whether the interlocutor was likable or not. And yeah, that is, I guess, a clear indicator of some sort of emotional bias here in this case, and it nicely illustrates this idea of dual process theory that also has to do something with attention, of course. Okay, so that's good. We've covered learning now. Let us jump to reasoning. And actually, we haven't talked about learning, actually. We've talked about social cognition, sorry. But let us go on to reasoning. And you might know this already, so this might be slightly the wrong audience to do this with, but I'll nonetheless do it. So I'll give you a task. You have to identify exactly which cards you must turn over in order to determine whether the following proposition, the following statement, is true or false. The statement is, If a card has an even number on one side, then its other side is red. And these are the cards. So which one would you flip? Any suggestions? What was that? The second one. And I mean, you could also flip more than one, but the idea is that you don't flip more than is necessary. So if you only flip 8, I actually have to disappoint you, that doesn't suffice. The cards, well, you're a professor of psychology, you know the Wason selection task, right? Okay, time-wise, we have problems, I see. Let's make this quick. Usually people would just take those cards which are in the description of the statement. So it says even number, so you choose 8, and it says on the other side, so you choose red. However, this is a propositional, so according to propositional logic, what we need to do is actually make sure that the antecedent is true, so it has an even number on one side, so we flip 8, and the other, the consequent is false, so we have to flip 8 and blue. However, most people, even those who've been trained on logics, usually don't get involved in the task as much and just fall prey to this bias to just take what's been indicated in the statement. So, Wason and Evans, who did this task, basically had a view about this, namely the matching bias, which is you just choose whatever was mentioned in the statement. And this is type 1 thinking again, the unconscious biased thinking, or not biased, but heuristic thinking. And that mostly indicates what choice you will make in the card flip. So it's quite simple and quite direct. You see what words are in, and you make the choice basically according to the words mentioned. And then when you're asked why you chose those cards, you'll come up with a very reasonable explanation, but quite likely not actually the explanation for why you did choose it, namely due to the matching bias, but you would say something like, well, those just are the cards that are most relevant, and so forth. Interestingly, if you change this task to be more realistic, people get much, much better at it. So actually, this might also be somewhat an artifact, but it's very nicely illustrative. And the effect still remains a bit. Okay, so this is Wason's and Evans' idea that we just basically act due to some unconscious mechanisms, and then we post hoc rationalize it and give some good reasons, which were absolutely not the reasons for why we acted, but still good reasons. And I think the classical view would rather be that we actually introspect first, we think about it, we come up with reasons for certain choices, and then we sort of do it. And then when we're asked, we just reiterate what our reasons were, we memorize what our reasons were, we remember it, and then we indicate our reasons. Okay, so this idea that the introspective explanation of what we do, what we choose to do, is often confabulated. That harmonizes very well with a lot of experimental work in the social psychology domain. 2 minutes, yep, which is good. So I brought you another scheme, which I think we might really only quickly glance over. So there are two views, one of which is default interventionism. So we basically, by default, act in accordance with our heuristics, with our type 1 thinking, which is then shortly checked. And either it says, nope, that's wrong, like by type 2 thinking, so by the conscious thinking. Either it intervenes and says that's wrong, or it doesn't intervene, in which case we just assume it's right. The other version that we can have is a parallel competitive model, where you have type 1 thinking again, and you have type 2 thinking, and you see which one, according to some parameters, we don't need to go into detail, is larger in number, and then from that a winner is chosen, and a decision is made based on that type of reasoning. Okay, we also have, I'm a philosopher, I already mentioned that, so of course I need to mention some philosophers here. We have a similar distinction in the philosophy of mind between a basic belief that need not be language involving, but is something basically that we think about the outside world, and then we have opinion, as Dennett calls it, Cohen calls it acceptance, and Frankish calls it superbelief, as opposed to a basic belief, which is language involving and actually requiring a bit more. So the basic beliefs are unconscious. Animals have beliefs too, of course they have, they need to. Otherwise, they wouldn't be very well suited in the process of evolution. While opinions and super beliefs are conscious, basic beliefs are implicit. Yeah, I'll speed up. I've got zero seconds left, so we'll just really quickly glance over this. Basic beliefs are parallel, computationally, and super beliefs are serial. And then there are dual systems ideas, which basically say there are really different psychological systems involved. And one of the very interesting and nice ones are in learning by this gentleman here, Arthur Reber, and he had a task called artificial grammar learning. And in a training phase, people were just trained on strings of letters which were produced according to a grammar that they didn't know. And like these weren't intelligible words to them, just strings of letter. However, in the test phase, when they were provided with new strings they hadn't seen before, which were either produced in accord with the grammar or not, they could indicate whether the string was grammatical or not, way above chance level. So they had learned something, although they didn't know they were learning something. That's why it's called implicit learning. Okay, so neuropsychology also sort of confirms this finding. There are different brain areas active on whether you're learning implicitly or explicitly. I guess we would also expect that. Then he thought that the implicit is the base case, sort of, and the explicit, so type 2 thinking, is rather like the thing that has been put on top, sort of. So the implicit is actually the first thing to occur. What are the relations of the Freudian unconscious and the cognitive unconscious, we might ask, but we won't answer it because we're short on time. So now I'm actually trying to find the lowest common denominator of the unconscious. And this is a number in the middle, and it has a lot of common denominators, which you can see in the outer bounds. So this is sort of a Venn diagram of common denominators. And this gentleman, Seymour Epstein, actually developed the cognitive experiential self-theory, and it is a dual system theory, but heavily influenced by psychoanalytics. So he said, well, Freud's theory has the problem that it is evolutionarily untenable, because, well, if you're just struggling with your Oedipal complex all the time, where do you get your food from? Why are you not being eaten? And so on. So he said, well, if that is sort of the base case that all animals have, good luck surviving. While dual process and dual systems theories, mostly, with maybe the exception of social psychology theories, lack the effective volitional component. So the model of the human that they are building is sort of lacking the thing that makes humans humans, right? It's really humans made of flesh and blood, who actually do get sad and do get angry and so on. And yeah, so he actually tried to use the best of both worlds. And that means that he distinguished between the experiential self, which is sort of the type 1, if we stick to the vocabulary of dual process theories, and rational processing systems, and they both compete and interact. And the unconscious is emotionally driven, and he also suggested that dependent on which systems you rather prefer, you'll have a different thinking style. Some more intuitive, more relying on type 1 thinking, some are more analytic, relying more on type 2 thinking. Yeah, we're almost through. What does it mean for consciousness science? Now that's good, because that's actually the briefest part, although it might be the most interesting. So I believe that any theory of consciousness should, in its very architecture, include the transition from the unconscious to consciousness. Because otherwise, where should it come from? You can't just produce it out of thin air, although Hameroff might want to make you believe that. And having a lowest common denominator of the unconscious might help us to delineate a bit between which mental processes can be candidates for consciousness, for a theory of consciousness, and which are not, in a more theoretically driven way, and not just by introspection as IIT does, or by axioms based on introspection. So now we're through. Thanks a bunch. This is a list of my references. You don't have to read it. And if you have any questions, I don't know if we have time for that, but if you'd like to ask them, you can also talk about that later on. Or now, I don't know, I'm not the organizer. What do you say, Christian? Klaus, sorry.
Thank you.